So thank you for attending this afternoon. I appreciate the interest. So this is a discussion about solubilization history and the status of the use of poorly soluble technology or technologies to address poorly soluble molecules. So to begin, I always like to start off with a quiz. So this is a audience participation. So does anybody know who the inventor of the World Wide Web is, or the internet? And it's not who you might think it is. Does anybody have a guess? It's a multiple choice, so I've made it easy for you. Out of all of these, who does anybody have an idea who the Metcalf? Good guess. Any other? No, it's good. It's good. Any other guesses about who? And you can't use your phone either. It's what you ask my kids what a question like that, and the first thing they do is Google it on their phone. Okay. No ideas. We'll go forward. So it's Berners-Lee is the most widely attributed inventor of the internet. However, all of these other folks played pretty critical roles in the development of the internet as well. And in fact, the key point of this slide is that without all of these other people, and actually many others for sure, the internet never would have existed. Okay, so multiple components had to come together to realize what we now know as the internet. So have you ever thought about the process? Like how does this even occur, right? So where did Berners-Lee even come up with the idea? How did he come about to the point where the internet suddenly existed where it didn't exist before? You ever thought about that process? It's kind of a problem-solving process, right? And in fact, actually, that happens in pharmaceuticals as well. And that's actually what I want to walk you through, is the process of innovation and how that has led to where we are today for poorly soluble molecules. So the way to think about this innovation process, the best example that I found is it's like a puzzle. And the puzzle has many stages of development. And the first stage is you have to have all the pieces, right? You have to have all the pieces to make a puzzle. A complete puzzle doesn't exist without all of those pieces. And in that early stage of innovation, it's really about gathering all of those pieces. Those pieces don't exist, actually, in many cases for a new innovation. And so an inventor needs to bring all of those pieces together in some fashion. So the next stage is to start assembling the pieces of that puzzle, right? So now that you have the various elements that are crucial to pull the innovation together, just like the internet needed Ethernet and microprocessors and many other things to realize the full internet, you need to pull the pieces together in some form. And usually in a real invention, that's a process that is iterative, and there's many starts and stops. You go a ways on one pathway, and then you find that that's a dead end, you back up, and you put other pieces together. Eventually, you end up with a full completed puzzle. And the key thing that people think about is that there's some eureka moment for an invention, right? You're sitting in, like Isaac Newton is a good example where people attribute him, sitting under an apple tree and the apple hits, and suddenly he thinks about gravity. But that's a real disservice to the whole invention process, right? To simplify it to that one event where an apple hits him on the head and he suddenly thinks of the equations for gravity is really a disservice to all of the work and hard effort he put into many years in advance for that, right? So the only significance of that last event is the fact that he had put so much work in ahead of time. And so if you were to do that puzzle again, or you give that puzzle to someone else, that last piece might be a different piece. So there really isn't any significance to it other than the fact that it represents a completion of the project. So how does that apply to to pharmaceuticals, and in particular, low solubility. So we'll do a case study, and we'll look at pharmaceutical spray drying, and I do mean to really isolate it as it relates to pharmaceuticals, because as it turns out, and I'll show you, spray drying has been around for quite a while. But like any invention, and I've already alluded to this, it really it involves, and you have to start with the context, right? So you have to set the stage for why that invention is relevant at a particular moment in time. And to do that for pharmaceuticals, I want to point out 5 key things that happened in the pharmaceutical industry over the last 160 years or so that led ultimately to where we are today. And it starts with the birth of Big Pharma. And it's kind of interesting because if you look back from 1850 to 1900, virtually all of the large pharma companies that are in existence today started in that 50-year span. There's a few exceptions, and there's many examples that were, consumed by mergers and acquisitions over the years, but many of the big pharma companies that exist today started in that time period. In fact, before 1850, there really weren't that many pharmaceutical agents on the market that we would consider real drugs today. Many of them were actual poisons, as it turns out. And the actives that were on the market were natural products and not necessarily pure products either. The second thing that happened was the agricultural evolution, or really the birth of agriculture. If you go before 1850, productivity of agricultural crops was very low, and during the late 1800s and early 1900s, that really flourished. And the main point about that is that it brought us 2 things. It brought us technology, and it brought us materials. And both of those things later became very critical to the solubilization technology area. Chemical manufacturing came into age at the same time. And then later in the 1900s and the 1950s and 60s was the birth of physical pharmacy. And that was very critical because what happened then was the application of physical chemistry to the formulation sciences. And before that time, it was really just an empirical study. People put things together in mortar and pestle and just kind of tried things out. But science was brought to bear at that point in time. And then finally, more recently, biological revolution has come to play a major critical role in the kinds of molecules that are developed in the pharmaceutical industry, and that's really shaped where we are today. And in fact, that leads to the second point, which is the driver. So now that you've sort of set an ecosystem from the last 150 years, you need one more thing, and that's a driver, right, for an invention. And the driver really is shown here, where over the last 30 years or so, the trend in the physical properties of APIs has led to more and more difficult molecules from a formulation perspective. And in particular, the lipophilicity of the molecules has increased an order of magnitude, and the water solubility has decreased an order of magnitude. And that's pretty significant if you think about it. So the kinds of molecules that are sorry, you can't really see this. The kinds of molecules today that were required to formulate are significantly more challenging than they were even 20 or 30 years ago. And it's my belief, anyway, that the driver for that is the biology and the targets that we're trying to drug. So if you look at spray drying in particular, that history, it's not an accident that I started in the 1850s or so with the timeline previously. Spray drying also has its roots starting in the 1860s. And there's a couple key points about this slide that I want to point out. First of all, the initial uses for spray drying were really conceived around foodstuffs, and in particular food preservation. And there were two key players that are attributed the sort of the initial invention of the spray drying process. And the first was Lamont, who was using it for eggs, and preservation of eggs. And it's actually pretty interesting if you read the patent, because he recognized right away that the key benefits of the spray drying process, or dividing a liquid into atoms, was that it greatly increased the stability, performance, and the quality of the product. In particular, the flavor and its stability with respect to microbial attack. So it desiccated the material and left it in a state that didn't allow the milk to spoil. And it also had a much better reconstitution, so it could be very easily dissolved back into water. And if you think about this now in the context of poorly soluble molecules, it's not so different, right? It's basically the same thing that we're trying to do with pharmaceutical compounds today. And the key point about that is that he recognized that this was an inherent property of the spray drying process. And of course, they didn't call it spray drying, and the reason they didn't is because the actual equipment to spray dry didn't even exist. All they knew is that the process of atomization really led to a superior product. About 6 years later, a doctor, actually, Samuel Percy, thought about the same process as it applied to milk, and for virtually the same exact reasons. It wasn't until another, 50 years before spray drying, as we know it today, was even recognizable. And the reason for that is that a spray dryer requires certain elements, key mechanical elements, in order for it to even exist. And those key elements, things like nozzles and pumps, didn't exist. And actually one more very key piece, which is particle collection. So those types of machines didn't exist in the 1800s and were developed more or less in the late 1800s, but not really into a workable unit device until about 1920. And in fact, some of the early spray dryers literally just sprayed into a chamber, and the powder collected to the point where it got so deep that it wasn't effective anymore. They would go in and shovel it out inside the chamber, empty it out, and start the process over again. So hardly a continuous process. And it wasn't until 1920, as I said, that the Merle Sol Corporation commercialized spray drying and manufactured dried powdered milk with it. And that's actually one of the main drivers of the technology evolution through the 40s and 50s. And the key driver there was, of course, preservation, but it also played a critical role in World War II, shipping dry bulk goods overseas for a lot less cost. In the 50s, there was a pretty big revolution in spray drying because it went into academia, and there were many scientists and engineers that spent a lot of time doing great research on the process of atomization and the fundamental properties of a spray dryer and how they actually work. And that's really where the engineering and the science of spray drying came about, is in the 1950s. And there were several key individuals that played a critical role. So the main thing I want to drive home about this point, or this slide, is that from the very beginning, spray drying as a process, it was recognized that it had these intrinsic properties that were a key benefit. And those key benefits of quality, performance, and stability still survive today, and that's actually what motivated people later on to try this technique out in pharmaceuticals. So how do we get from the 50s to now? This is really where the process that was originally developed for foodstuffs transitioned into the pharmaceuticals. And it again starts with this physical pharmacy. In the 1960s, dispersions, solid dispersions came about, and that was a product of the physical pharmacy efforts, and where people were really trying to experiment with more and more difficult compounds to formulate. They had recognized the utility of physical chemistry in the formulation process, and they started to apply those tools to the limited number of molecules that were poorly soluble. Chu and Riegelman in 1971 then summarized the last 20 years of work in the poorly soluble space in a seminal paper. It wasn't another 10 or 12 years later, though, that a solid dispersion, as we know it today, was manufactured on a spray dryer, and that was done by Corrigan. And he did a formulation, actually several formulations, using a small-scale spray dryer to form a solid dispersion with a poorly soluble API and a polymeric material. And that's really where we are today. And that's why that's such a significant thing. Previous to that, people had made solid dispersions, but they were really mainly around using other small molecules like urea, for example. BCS came along. Nairo was actually a pretty key player in this. They started the first pharmaceutical spray dryer plant in one of their facilities in Europe, and that was really a driver based upon the needs of a particular pharmaceutical company that had a poorly soluble molecule and needed pharmaceutical grade spray drying to bring that product to the market. And now that brings us up to now, where I've called out ivacaftor. That's one particular one. But the main point I wanted to bring out about the current state is that there's an exponential increase now at this point in time in the industry with respect to the literature and patents and products. And in fact, you can see that nicely in this graph, where the blue line here shows the number of products. This is the cumulative number of products that have been brought to market using solid dispersion technology. And in full disclosure, that's not just spray drying, by the way. That's other methods like HME, for example, is a suitable process for making a solid dispersion. It's also fair to point that the number of products for lipids or soft gel technology is an older and more widely used technology. But both, I would say, are tracking pretty nicely with the increase in numbers of poorly soluble molecules that are in the market. In fact, this graph, and people may have seen this before, this is now updated through 2014, where there were, in 13 and 14, I think there were an additional 5 new molecules that were brought to market using poorly soluble technology. So, what lies ahead? Well, as you might imagine from a puzzle, and I mentioned this before, where you have any individual sits down with a particular puzzle, you never know which the last piece is, right? So the point of this is that inventions are an indeterminate thing, right? You never know exactly what the future may bring. And it really depends upon the context. So the history, how many pieces of the puzzle you have. And so what I would encourage you to do is think about all of the various tools that you've been exposed to in your own experience, and think about how those different things can be combined. That's really where an invention comes from. And that's really what's going to lead us to what lies ahead. And in particular, I think you need to have a low barrier for combinations and trying new things, right? So there's really no dumb question. There's no dumb way to put things together. And I think that the more broad you think about the different types of technology, the more experience that you have, and the more unique combinations that you can bring together, the more likelihood you'll come up with an invention that's useful to others, and that's the important part. I've thrown out a few things, and I have to admit that as it relates to poorly soluble molecules, I think that the real revolutions aren't going to be necessarily around materials or a new process. It's going to be around technology and how we combine those, and how we use things like, for example, electronics and big data, and combine that in better and smarter ways. And I think that that's really where the revolution is headed. So with that, I'll close and take any questions.